Salem, Massachusetts. Autumn of 1898. The cobblestones glisten beneath a thin veil of fog, and the town, once alive with the songs of sailors, now hums with the low, industrial groan of the new century. Yet under it all, something older breathes. They say the past never truly leaves Salem. It simply hides beneath the brick, beneath the earth, beneath the mind. Before we step deeper into this story, where are you watching from? The strange, isn't it? How far tales like this travel. Maybe it's the distance that keeps us safe. Maybe. Dr. Phineas Winthrop was not the sort of man to vanish. 46 years old, precise, composed, a physician whose methods were decades ahead of his time. He called it the study of inherited psychological imprints, what we might now call echo-trauma. He believed that pain could be passed down through bloodlines like a haunting. And yet, one October morning, the man who treated the minds of others failed to appear for work. First, there were excuses, a house call, an illness. But by nightfall, whispers began to move through Salem like cold air through old brick. The doctor's bed was untouched. His watch, a family heirloom, lay on the nightstand. His journal was gone, and his overcoat, despite the October chill, still hung by the door. The police began with the logical theories, robbery, flight, madness, but Salem is not a city where logic has ever stayed long. Mrs. Abigail Putnam, his housekeeper, was the last to see him. She said he'd barely eaten, eyes darting toward the window again and again. When she asked who he was expecting, he'd replied, "Not a visitor, Mrs. Putnam, a revelation." And so it began, the unraveling of one man's pursuit of truth, and the city that would pay the price for it. But here's a question for you. How did this story find you? Was it chance? Or something darker that led you here tonight? By the second night, investigators were combing through his home. Nothing missing but his clothes and that leather journal he carried everywhere. The fire in his study had long gone cold. And yet, the air, Mrs. Putnam swore, still smelled faintly of the sea. Strange for a man who lived far from the harbor. Records from the Salem Evening News dated October 19th tell us that Dr. Winthrop's last known movements were ordinary. But the mind of the man was not. He had been consumed by the idea that trauma could live on after death, passed like an infection through memory itself. His notes mentioned 3 old families, the Mathers, the Corwins, and the Hawthorns, names heavy with Salem's ghosts. And in every line of his writing, one phrase kept repeating, the inner room. The doctor had written that he was close to a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of the human mind. A discovery hidden in plain sight for 2 centuries. And then nothing. The entries stop. When the authorities pried open his desk, they found another, smaller notebook. Inside, the same families, the same phrase, but also sketches, triangles drawn between landmarks, one of them connecting Fort Lee, the Corwin House, and the old harbor tunnels. They didn't know it then, but they were looking at a map of something buried beneath Salem. If you're watching this far, remember, this is not just a disappearance story. It's the first movement in a much deeper symphony of fear. Because what Dr. Winthrop uncovered was not simply science. It was a pattern, a network, and something that looked back when he began to look down. Next, Chapter 2. The Witch House and the Inner Room. If this tale already has you leaning forward, subscribe before the next moon rises. The next chapter reveals what Dr. Winthrop found inside the house that would not let him leave. Into Dr. Phineas Winthrop's disappearance led, inevitably, to the oldest house in Salem, a place where history still clings to the air like soot. The locals called it the Witch House, once the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, one of the magistrates of 1692. It was said that the walls of that house had listened, truly listened, to the cries of the accused. By 1898, the house belonged to Miss Constance Vaughan, a reclusive woman descended from the Corwins. Her family name, her isolation, and her iron insistence on privacy made her the subject of whispers long before the doctor vanished. When investigators came to her door, Miss Vaughan first denied ever meeting Dr. Winthrop. But servants speak differently when shadows grow longer. Her housekeeper, Harriet Rhodes, told a different story, that the doctor had come 3 times that autumn, each time at dusk, each time leaving after midnight. They would meet in the library. No lights, no voices, only the faint scratching of a pen. When pressed about the visits, Miss Vaughn said it was for her insomnia. A polite lie that broke apart under the smallest touch. Investigators noted certain rooms in the oldest part of the house were kept locked. Miss Vaughn claimed the keys had been lost years earlier, but the locks looked new. When the police returned with a warrant, she obeyed, but her hands shook as she opened the front door. The search revealed nothing, at least nothing that could be explained. But those who entered the house later wrote that the air inside was different, heavier. They said the walls seemed to absorb sound, that footsteps felt muffled, that light dulled as it passed from room to room. One officer described a sensation like standing inside a lung that had stopped breathing. Weeks passed. The town grew colder. The case, it seemed, was beginning to fade, until Private Josiah Dalton, a soldier stationed at Fort Lee, returned to Salem. He had been on sentry duty the night the doctor vanished. He reported seeing a man walking along the shore road just after midnight, moving toward the fort without a lantern. He paused once, turned back toward the town as if hesitating, then continued into the darkness toward the point, a stretch of rocks at the water's edge. That was the last anyone saw of Dr. Winthrop alive. Dalton's statement led searchers to comb the shoreline, and there, between 2 tide-worn stones, they found a single clue, a small brass key, antique, its surface green with age. To fit no lock in Winthrop's home, none in his office, and when shown to Miss Vaughn, she stared too long before whispering, "I have not seen it before," then demanded it be taken away. A week later, the doctor's missing notebook was found, hidden behind a panel in his hospital office desk. Inside, written in shorthand and fevered scrawl, were references to the judge's house and something called the inner room. He believed there was a chamber in the Corwin house, sealed generations ago, containing the evidence he sought, the proof that fear could be inherited. He wrote, "Certain spaces transmit memory, not through story but through structure. Fear, if concentrated long enough, leaves a residue. Here's a thought for you while you're still with me. Do you believe places remember what was done inside them? Or do they only echo the fear of those who enter? Tell me below. I read every theory." Investigators returned to the witch house. At first, Miss Vaughn refused them entry. Only when presented with the hidden notebook did she relent. This time, they searched the cellar. The stone walls were centuries old, yet one corner showed newer mortar, too clean, too deliberate. When the officers pressed against it, a hollow sound answered. They began to remove the stones. Behind them was a narrow opening, small enough that a man would have to crouch to enter. The space beyond was only 6 feet square. No windows, no other entrance. Inside, they found 3 objects placed neatly on the dirt floor: a rusted iron key, a daguerreotype photograph of a group of men before a tunnel mouth, and Dr. Winthrop's missing journal, open to its final entry. The writing was frantic, uneven. "I have confirmed my suspicions beyond any doubt," it read. "The tunnels exist. They were sealed not out of fear of invasion, but because of what was discovered within. Tomorrow night, I will access the entrance at the point." Something was brought back that night, something that lingers still. That was October 16th, 1898, the night before he disappeared. Miss Vaughn denied all knowledge of the chamber, but when she was shown the photograph, she grew pale. One of the men, she whispered, looked like her grandfather. The witch house was sealed again after that, but the officers who had entered reported dreams for weeks. Narrow tunnels, the sound of breathing behind stone, and a faint knocking that followed them long after they left. If you're still here, you're part of the few who know the truth. Stay close, subscribe before the next chapter, because next we follow the tunnels themselves. What waits beneath Salem begins to stir. Winter had buried Salem beneath a crust of ice. The investigation, like the harbor itself, had frozen over. Until one clue, one old sailor's rumor, broke the silence. They called it the Point, a jagged outcropping of rock north of Fort Lee, where the tide whispered louder than the wind. It was there that a search team, armed with lanterns and picks, found a fissure in the rock face, freshly disturbed. The opening was no wider than a man's shoulders. And yet someone had gone through. The officers pried away the stone until the gap gaped open like a wound. They crawled inside and found themselves standing in a sloping tunnel carved from the bedrock, the ceiling braced by timber dark with age. The air was damp, but strangely clean, as though it had been waiting to be breathed again. No rat scurried, no drip echoed. Only the distant pulse of the tide pressed against the walls. They walked half a mile before the tunnel split in 3 directions. And there, caught on a jagged edge of rock, they found the torn fabric of a man's waistcoat. Dr. Winthrop's. The cloth was still pliable, not yet stiffened by salt or time. He had been there recently. 2 of the branches ended in collapses, sealed long ago by fallen stone. But the 3rd continued. The walls shifted from rough-cut rock to lined brick. A strange craftsmanship, old, yet deliberate. Small alcoves opened along the way, each containing rotted crates, blackened by moisture. They had the feel of smugglers' hides, but older and built with care. Then the tunnel widened into a chamber 20 feet square. Shelves carved from the stone held dozens of leather-bound books. On a table in the center lay Dr. Winthrop's pocket watch, the same one his housekeeper swore had been left on his nightstand. Next to it, torn journal pages. The entries began calmly enough, measurements, diagrams, sketches of the tunnel's layout. But the handwriting soon collapsed into frenzy. Records kept by Judge Corwin, separate from trial transcripts. Subjects observed under duress. Fear extracted, documented, refined. Then the final line. Something was being cultivated, harvested at the moment of maximum dread. Do you believe fear can be collected? Not the feeling, but the essence of it, the charge that lingers in the air when terror peaks. Or is that just superstition made solid by imagination? Tell me what you think, because it matters how you interpret what comes next. Beyond the chamber, the tunnel grew colder. The air turned sharp, their breath visible in the lamplight. And then they reached it, an iron door, embedded in stone, engraved with twisting figures locked in agony. No handle, no latch, only a small, circular keyhole at its center. When one officer tested the rusted key found in the Corwin house, it fit. But the door did not open. It shuddered once, groaned like something alive, then refused to move. They tried again, and the air turned icy. The lanterns flickered, and the men swore the figures on the door seemed to shift, as though the tortured faces were breathing. The temperature dropped so suddenly their breath fogged and crystallized. The key turned, but the door would not yield. Finally, they withdrew. But one officer, Captain Harlan Pierce, lingered. He placed his ear to the cold metal and whispered later that he'd heard movement on the other side, like something pacing. The footprints of Dr. Winthrop ended there. He had stood before that iron door, waiting, pacing in a tight circle. Then, somehow, he turned away, not back toward the sea, but deeper still. A narrow side passage led to the hidden chamber beneath the witch house, the same chamber where his journal had been found. From below, he could have reached it. He could have placed the journal there himself. But where did he go after that? No prints led out. No body was ever recovered. The tunnels were sealed shortly afterward. Brick walls laid over every entrance. The chamber beneath the Corwin house was closed, and Miss Constance Vaughn sold her estate and vanished into quiet exile in Boston. But something about that iron door never left those who'd seen it. For weeks, they dreamt of its engravings, of the shapes twisting behind the metal, and one by one they stopped speaking of it. If you're still following this far, you're part of the few who are meant to hear the rest. Because in the next chapter, the story climbs back to the surface, and the shadows that followed Dr. Winthrop begin to move through Salem itself. Next, Chapter 4, The Legacy of Fear. Don't wander off yet. The next chapter reveals what the townspeople began to see when the doctor disappeared beneath the city. In the weeks after the tunnels were sealed, Salem tried to breathe again. The newspapers called it a tragedy, a man lost to his obsession. But the town knew better. The air itself had changed. Something unseen had loosened from the earth below and begun to drift, quietly, through the streets. At first, it was only whispers, strange noises in the old houses, footsteps where there should be none. But by spring, the stories grew darker. Visitors to the Joshua Ward house spoke of sudden chills, and a tall man glimpsed at the top of the stairs. Tenants of the Ropes mansion swore they saw someone standing in doorways, watching, and every description was the same. A thin man with a scholar's posture and hollow eyes. Dr. Phineas Winthrop, they said, had come back. Salem has always fed on its own legends. But this was different. This time, the fear wasn't theatrical, it was clinical. The same symptoms began to appear across generations. Insomnia, claustrophobia, recurring nightmares of tunnels and doors. At Danvers State Hospital, new patients described the same dream. A stone corridor, a locked iron door, and something scratching softly behind it. Doctors called it Salem-specific melancholia. But one physician, Dr. Frederick Packard, saw a pattern. He revisited Winthrop's abandoned notes and wrote in his private journal, "I have found the door. God help me." Winthrop was right. A month later, he resigned his post and disappeared into seclusion. If you were in their place, would you have looked for the door again? Or sealed it forever? Tell me below. Was Winthrop cursed for seeking truth, or chosen to find it? By the early 1900s, nearly every trace of Winthrop's work was gone. His library, auctioned without record. His journals, destroyed in a fire. Even police reports went missing from archives. But one thing remained, a sealed envelope, discovered in the cornerstone of Salem Hospital during renovations in 1923. Inside was a single page written in Winthrop's hand. To whoever discovers this record, what Judge Corwin began did not end with him. The experiment continues through the generations. We are subjects, not citizens, observed through the keyhole by something that hungers for our dread. The letter vanished from the Salem Historical Society 2 years later. By then, the town had learned to stop asking questions. The witch house became a tourist site. The tunnels were paved over and forgotten. Danvers closed its wards, then its doors, and the stories sank into the soil until only the dreams remained. Even now, descendants of those early Salem families report the same nightmares. Narrow corridors, echoing footsteps, heat cold to the touch, and a whisper from the dark that asks, "Do you want to see what's behind the door?" Next, Chapter 5, The Shadow Archive. In the next part, the truth resurfaces. Letters, research, and disappearances that prove the experiment never ended. If you're still here, stay close. The story is no longer history, it's inheritance. By the turn of the 20th century, Dr. Phineas Winthrop's name had become a whisper only archivists and eccentrics dared utter. But the silence was not natural, it was curated. Files disappeared, letters misplaced, witnesses forgot, and those who tried to remember often vanished. Between 1899 and 1925, 7 researchers, journalists, and historians who touched the Winthrop case either died suddenly or went missing. Professor Edmund Garfield, the first to map the tunnels, vanished while conducting field research. A nurse from Danvers, Melline Whipple, wrote in her diary that she heard breathing through the walls. The final page of her journal ended mid-sentence. Detective Harlan Pierce, the officer who first found the iron door, returned to it in secret 13 years later, and was never seen again. Each disappearance left behind a fragment. A burned notebook, a lost letter, a photograph blurred at the edges. Together, they formed what researchers later called the Shadow Archive. An archive that shouldn't exist. One that rearranges itself as though it doesn't want to be found. If you've been following from the beginning, ask yourself, what would you risk for proof? Would you open the door again? or look away and call it myth the way Salem always does. By 1918, a journalist named Josephine Marsh began writing a serialized exposé on the Winthrop case. Her first article was published in the Boston Herald, Echoes Beneath Salem. It ended with a promise. Next week, the surviving records will prove the tunnels still exist. The second article never appeared. Marsh vanished 3 days later. Her editor withdrew the entire series, claiming personal distress on her part. Her notes, recovered from her boarding room, included one line circled twice in ink. "He stood outside my window tonight. I think he's waiting for me to dream." Officially, Salem moved on. Unofficially, something else took hold. Old families began to leave the city. Those who stayed reported faint rapping sounds beneath their homes during winter tides. At night, a few said they could hear voices coming from the ground, not words but the rhythm of speech. When workers repairing the foundations of Salem Hospital uncovered a sealed wall in 1923, they found not a tunnel, but a door, a twin to the one beneath the city, and on it, carved shallow into the metal, the same words that had haunted Winthrop's final notes. Fear sustains. By the mid-century, the last of the original records had vanished. The Essex Institute fire of 1902 destroyed every remaining document related to the case. And when the Massachusetts State Archives were audited in 1970, the Winthrop file number was found missing from every index. Not misfiled, deleted. Only rumors remained, passed like a virus through historians, researchers, and folklore collectors. A pattern of interference, they called it. A force that not only erased the past but punished those who tried to preserve it. Do you think the truth is ever really lost, or just waiting for the right mind to find it? Tell me what you believe, because some doors don't open to curiosity. They open to recognition. By the end of the century, the story returned, drawn to the surface by technology. Digital scans of damaged archives uncovered Winthrop's name again, alongside references to similar inheritance phenomena in Europe. And then, in 2021, a woman claiming to be a descendant of Constance Vaughan delivered an object to the Salem Historical Society. A small brass key, ancient, tarnished, with a note attached that read, "Never return this to the door." The key disappeared from storage within a week. No footage, no break-in, just absence. And with that, the Shadow Archive closed again, silently, as if it had finished watching. If you're still here, you've crossed a threshold most people never reach. Because what comes next isn't about history. It's about what Salem is now. A city that learned how to forget, and what happens when forgetting fails. Next, Chapter 6. The Inheritance of Echoes. Subscribe before the next moon rises. The next chapter reveals what's still passing quietly through the bloodlines of Salem. More than a century after Dr. Phineas Winthrop walked into the tunnels beneath Salem, his theory, the one dismissed as pseudoscience, began to surface again. He called it echotrauma. Modern researchers call it epigenetic inheritance. Science now knows what he only suspected, that terror, grief, and suffering can mark the body's code, that memory itself can live in the blood. And for the families of Salem, that inheritance never broke. In 2005, a team from Miskatonic University's Department of Psychology conducted a study tracing descendants of the town's founding families. They found something no statistical model could explain: a pattern of identical dreams, nightmares of tunnels, of whispering walls, of a cold iron door. Most subjects had never met. Many had never even visited Salem. And yet, they described the same figure, tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to recognize them. When the researchers analyzed the data, they found the dreams clustered by lineage. Families tied to the witch trials, to the Corwins, the Hawthorns, and one name that kept appearing in the genealogies: Winthrop. But before the study could be published, the raw data vanished. A burst pipe flooded the archive room, destroying the files. The lead researcher retired early and refused all interviews. Her assistant, years later, said only one thing to a local reporter: "We didn't discover the pattern. We completed it." If you were born in Salem, if your ancestors were here in 1692, do you ever dream of narrow places? Of being watched through a wall? Maybe you think it's coincidence. Or maybe the doctor's experiment never ended. Tell me, do you think fear can evolve? That something could use memory the way roots use soil? By 2015, renovation crews at the old Danvers State Hospital uncovered a sealed basement room. Inside, a desk, a chair, and a single page burned along the edges. Before it was destroyed in a sudden fire, a worker copied the words onto his phone. The text read, "The observation continues. Some subjects still dream of the door. It opens only for those who remember." Afterward, he began experiencing the same nightmares. His wife told investigators he would wake gasping for air, whispering, "It's open now." In 2020, digital restorations of the Essex Institute archives revealed fragments of Winthrop's letters to European colleagues. He referenced a network of observation points, towns linked by shared episodes of hysteria and persecution. England, Germany, France, all sites of witch trials, all with legends of tunnels beneath their oldest buildings. He believed the fear from those events was not lost but channeled, collected and studied. Each generation, he wrote, contributes its echo. Maybe that's why Salem never feels fully at rest. It isn't haunted by spirits. It's haunted by memory itself, the residue of centuries pressing against the present. Because what Winthrop discovered was never just a mystery. It was a design. And the question is no longer whether it exists, but whether we are still inside it. Next, Chapter 7. The Door That Never Closed. The final chapter, where the truth meets the present, and the echoes become real. If you followed this far, don't stop now. The end isn't the end. It's the moment the story starts looking back at you. Salem, today. The old streets are crowded with tourists and costumed guides, their laughter echoing through centuries of silence. Children eat caramel apples where the accused once wept. And beneath it all, the tunnels still sleep. Or perhaps they wait. The witch house is now a museum, its rooms sterilized by history and souvenir light. Visitors pass by the cellar stairs without knowing that the mortar beneath them hides a sealed chamber, one that has not been opened since 1899. Yet something about that house still breathes. When the tide shifts, the air grows heavy. Those who linger too long claim to hear three faint sounds: a knock, a whisper, and the faint click of a turning key. In the last decade, Salem historians began to digitize the city's surviving archives. And in one misfiled folder, a single photograph appeared, unknown, unlabeled. It showed a man standing before an iron door. The image was dated 1898. The man's face was indistinct, but his shadow stretched forward, through the keyhole, as if drawn toward whatever waited beyond. Experts called it an exposure flaw. But those who have seen the photograph swear the shadow doesn't belong to the man at all. Here's the part no one likes to admit. The tunnels were never truly sealed. Ground radar surveys in 1998, 2015, and again in 2020 confirmed the hollow network beneath the city. Corridors that extend beneath Essex Street, beneath the harbor, even beneath the hospital grounds. Each time access was requested, it was denied. Preservation, they said. But sealed doors, like memories, are only sealed until someone needs them opened. Do you think the past ever really ends? Or do we just walk in circles through its echoes, convinced we're the ones moving forward? Last year, a maintenance worker at the Peabody Essex Museum claimed to find an old key lodged in a heating vent. Small, brass. When he picked it up, he said the metal was warm, almost alive. He left it on a desk overnight. By morning, it was gone. That same night, motion sensors in the museum's archive wing triggered 3 times between midnight and 3 a.m. The footage showed nothing except for one frame, a shape, tall, thin, watching the shelves. The timestamp read October 17th, the anniversary of Dr. Phineas Winthrop's disappearance. The city refuses to acknowledge these reports, but the locals know better. Each October, the dreams return. Tunnels, doors, breathing walls, and always the whisper, "It opens only for those who remember." So if you've stayed through this story, if you've listened past reason and through fear, understand this: the experiment was never about one man's obsession. It was about us. The way terror passes through blood, the way memory feeds on attention. Dr. Winthrop didn't disappear into the tunnels. He crossed into the echo. And every time the story is told, every time someone listens long enough, the door shifts a little more. If you've made it to this point, you're part of the few who know. Don't dream of the tunnels tonight. And if you hear the sound of metal turning in the dark, do not look back, because some doors never closed. They only waited for someone to remember how to open them.